If you ever missed the days when the White House felt steady and respectful, this story will take you back. Because the way Barack handled Trump's insult to Michelle was pure Obama. Smart, steady, and unforgettable. It was one of those events that everyone was talking about. The kind where you could feel the anticipation buzzing in the air long before it began. The hall was grand, filled with polished lights and rows of people waiting for something big to happen. Cameras stood ready, reporters whispered into microphones, and the audience murmured softly as the stage lights came up. President Donald Trump had arrived with his usual energy, waving to the crowd, wearing that confident expression he was famous for. And not far from him sat former President Barack Obama, calm, collected, his trademark composure steady as always. The two men hadn't shared a stage in years, and this was the first time since Trump's return to the White House. The tension was undeniable. The event was meant to be about leadership, how America could move forward in a time of division. But everyone knew that putting Trump and Obama in the same room was bound to be more than just polite discussion. Their history was long and filled with sharp exchanges, and every eye in the room was watching to see what would happen next. When Obama spoke first, his voice carried the same steady warmth that people had missed. He didn't attack or criticize anyone. Instead, he talked about responsibility, about how real leaders inspire hope instead of fear. His tone was measured, but his words carried quiet strength. He spoke about respect, how every person in power must remember that leadership is not about ego, but about service. People nodded as he spoke. Some smiled. Even a few of Trump's supporters seemed caught up in the rhythm of his words. Obama had that ability to command attention without raising his voice to make people listen because of how he said things, not just what he said. When he finished, the applause was strong and genuine. But Trump's eyes told a different story. He clapped briefly, then leaned over to whisper something to an aide. His face tightened slightly, the kind of look he often had when he felt challenged. Then came his turn. The moment his name was announced, the energy shifted. Trump stood up quickly, buttoned his jacket, and walked to the podium with the confidence of a man who knew the crowd would listen, even if not everyone would agree. He began by praising his administration's achievements, as he often did, listing numbers, statistics, and victories. His voice was louder than Obama's had been, his gestures bigger, his tone sharper. He wanted the spotlight, and he took it with force. At first, the audience listened politely, but as Trump's speech went on, his tone began to change. The compliments turned into comparisons, and the comparisons turned into jabs. He mentioned how some leaders like to talk about unity, but they didn't get much done. The crowd murmured. Everyone knew who he meant. Then, almost casually, he shifted gears, and that's when things took a turn. Trump said, "Some people love to talk about class and grace, but they had 8 years to prove it. And what did we really see? Just talk." Even the First Lady, then she spent more time writing books than fixing problems. The audience went silent. The mention of Michelle Obama's name, even indirectly, drew a sharp breath from many. It wasn't unusual for Trump to throw a jab, but this one felt personal. He smiled slightly after saying it as if daring someone to react. All eyes turned to Obama, but he didn't move. He didn't frown. He didn't even shift in his chair. He sat perfectly still, listening, watching, waiting. The stillness itself seemed to speak louder than any interruption could. Trump continued, sensing the silence. He added, "Some people were born into charm and speeches. Others were born to lead and make results happen." His words were wrapped in sarcasm, and though he didn't say the name again, it was clear who he was talking about. A few people in the audience chuckled nervously, unsure if it was safe to react. Others whispered under their breath. The tension thickened like a storm building slowly in the distance. Obama's face remained calm. His expression didn't reveal even a flicker of irritation, but anyone who had watched him closely before knew that kind of silence meant something was brewing. Not anger, but thought. He was planning his response, not rushing to give it. Trump went on for several more minutes, switching between boasting about his achievements and taking small cutting digs at his predecessor. The more he spoke, the clearer it became that this was not just a political speech. It was personal. Behind the stage, aides shifted uncomfortably. The organizers had not expected the event to turn so sharp so fast. The moderator glanced nervously at both men, unsure whether to interrupt or let it play out. By the time Trump wrapped up, the air in the room felt charged, like the moment before thunder cracks. He ended his speech with a smile and a quick wave, clearly satisfied with his performance. But Obama still hadn't said a word. He simply leaned back slightly in his seat, gave a small nod, and glanced toward the podium. It wasn't a look of anger. It was something deeper, something that said, "I heard you, and when I speak, you'll listen." The camera zoomed in, capturing his calm face beside Trump's confident grin. It was a picture of contrast. One man loud and fiery, the other silent and steady. Everyone in that room knew one thing for certain. Obama wasn't done. He was waiting patiently, deliberately for the right moment. And when that moment came, it would change the entire tone of the night. The tension had only just begun. Trump had finished his speech with a triumphant smile, nodding to the crowd as if he had just delivered the knockout blow of the night. But in that room full of flashing cameras and uneasy faces, no one could quite celebrate. Something about the way he had mentioned Michelle Obama's name, or rather the way he didn't mention it, but made sure everyone knew who he meant, left the air heavy. It wasn't just the words he used. It was the tone, the smirk, the half-laugh that followed. For those who had followed politics long enough, it was familiar. It was Trump's signature move to disguise an insult as a truth, to mix humor with humiliation, to pretend a jab was just a joke. And while some of his supporters laughed softly, others shifted in their seats, unsure how far this would go. Trump stood at the podium for a moment longer, scanning the room. His eyes found Obama sitting calmly near the front. There was something about Obama's stillness that seemed to annoy him, as if silence itself was a challenge. Trump leaned forward, gripping the microphone, and his voice took on that sharp tone again. "You know," he said, "some people like to act like they're saints. They talk about going high, but maybe they say that because they've never really been low enough to understand the rest of us." The crowd gasped again. Everyone knew the phrase, "When they go low, we go high." It was Michelle Obama's famous line, one she had repeated during some of the nation's most divided times. It had become a message of hope for millions. And now Trump had twisted it into a taunt. The insult didn't sound loud, but it hit hard. It wasn't just against Michelle Obama. It was against everything she stood for. The message was clear that her kindness was weakness, her dignity a disguise. Some in the crowd tried to clap, unsure whether to encourage him or to cover the uncomfortable silence. Others sat frozen. A few reporters exchanged glances, scribbling notes with hands that trembled slightly. They knew what this meant. Obama didn't move. His hands were folded, his posture relaxed, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet intensity, like someone listening not just to words, but to motives. He had been through years of public attacks before. He had heard worse. But what made this different was that Trump had chosen to drag Michelle into it, not as a political opponent, but as a woman, a mother, a symbol of grace who had stayed above the noise, even when it was aimed directly at her. Trump wasn't finished. He looked around the room again, scanning faces, feeding off the attention. "You know," he added with a chuckle, "I never understood why people made such a big deal about her speeches. Nice words, sure, but actions not much to see." That sentence landed like a stone thrown into still water. The ripples spread immediately. The audience began whispering. Some frowned. Others avoided eye contact, pretending to check their phones. Everyone knew Trump's words were unfair, even cruel, but no one dared speak. Obama stayed perfectly still. His calmness now felt electric, almost unnerving. It wasn't the calm of someone who didn't care. It was the calm of someone who cared deeply, but refused to let anger control the moment. Inside, though, he was thinking not about how to get even, but about how to respond in a way that would rise above the chaos, yet still strike at the truth. Because for Obama, moments like this weren't about revenge. They were about character. The cameras kept rolling. Trump, sensing he had stirred the room, smiled wider. He talked about strong leadership and telling it like it is. He said that the country needed more action and fewer inspirational words. But by now, most people weren't really listening. They were watching Obama waiting. Obama finally looked up and met Trump's gaze. It was a simple glance, but it spoke volumes. It wasn't defiant and it wasn't submissive. It was steady, the look of someone who had already decided how this would end even before it began. That glance made Trump hesitate. For the first time in the evening, his rhythm broke. He paused mid-sentence, glanced down at his notes, and cleared his throat. A faint awkward chuckle slipped through his words as he tried to recover. The moment didn't last long, but everyone saw it. That tiny crack in his confidence. Trump finished his remarks quickly after that. The applause was polite but uncertain. As he walked back to his seat, he looked toward Obama again, as if trying to read him. Obama only nodded slightly, as though acknowledging the words, but refusing to let them linger. Michelle Obama's name still hung in the air like a spark that hadn't gone out. It wasn't forgotten. It was waiting. The crowd knew something was coming. Obama had been silent for too long, and his silence was louder than any shout. A reporter sitting near the front whispered to another, "He's going to respond. Just watch." And they were right. Obama had always believed that timing mattered more than volume. He wouldn't interrupt. He wouldn't react in the heat of the moment. He would wait until the perfect silence fell and then he would speak. But before that moment came, there was something powerful about the way he just sat there. It reminded everyone in that room and everyone who had ever underestimated him that patience can be the sharpest weapon of all. As the applause faded and Trump leaned back in his chair, the cameras caught one last image before cutting away. Obama's calm, thoughtful face and Trump's forced grin beside him. Two men, two completely different kinds of power. One shouted to be heard, the other waited to be remembered. And though no one could predict it yet, the words Obama was about to say would echo far louder than any insult spoken that night. The room was still humming from Trump's words, though the applause had died out quickly, like a spark smothered before it could grow into a flame. People shifted in their seats, unsure whether to clap longer or pretend the last few minutes hadn't just happened. The tension was almost physical, the kind that wraps around you and makes even breathing feel too loud. Trump had returned to his seat, satisfied with himself, whispering something to an aide beside him. He seemed relaxed, almost smug, like a performer who believed the show was already over. But it wasn't. Far from it, because Barack Obama was still there, silent, steady, and unreadable. For a long moment, nothing happened. The moderator glanced nervously between the two men, sensing the unease ripple through the audience. Then, as if the silence itself had invited him, Obama stood. The murmurs stopped immediately. All eyes turned to him. He didn't rush. He didn't clear his throat or raise a hand for attention. He simply walked to the podium, calm and deliberate, as though he had already decided that every word he was about to say mattered. When he began speaking, his voice was low and even. "You know," he said, "it's easy to talk about leadership when the spotlight's on you. It's harder when no one's watching. When your choices define who you are, not your applause." The audience leaned in. His tone wasn't angry, but it carried a quiet weight that made people listen without blinking. He spoke about integrity, about the responsibility that comes with power. He talked about how true leaders are judged not by their words, but by how they treat those who can't give them anything in return. And then, without warning, he turned his eyes directly toward Trump. His expression didn't change, but his voice took on a sharper edge. Not louder, just clearer. "You've spent time talking about my wife," he said softly. "But here's something I'd like you to think about." The room froze. Obama paused for just a second, long enough for everyone to hold their breath. Then he said it slowly, clearly, every word landing like a drop of water in a still pond. "Tell Barron who his real mother is." The silence that followed didn't feel real. It was the kind of silence that empties the air. The kind that makes people forget to move. Trump's smile vanished, his head jerked slightly, his face tightening as though he hadn't heard correctly. A ripple ran through the crowd, a mix of confusion, disbelief, and shock. Obama didn't repeat himself. He didn't need to. The weight of the question hung there, heavy and deliberate. It took only a moment for people to understand what he meant. It wasn't a random question. It was a reminder, a sharp, cutting reminder of the strange and uncomfortable things Trump himself had said years ago about his daughter Ivanka. Remarks that many had found deeply unsettling, even disturbing remarks that had followed him for years, whispered about in conversations, but rarely spoken to his face. Obama hadn't insulted Trump. He hadn't raised his voice or called him names. He had simply turned the mirror around and forced him to see himself. Trump opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He looked around as if searching for support, but even his aide seemed frozen. A few people in the audience shifted awkwardly, unsure what to do. No one had expected this. No one had expected Obama to strike with so much precision. Quietly, cleanly, without a single shout.